Okay, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are joining us from. If you haven't come on to one of our lives before, my name is Alexandria. I am a co-founder and the CEO of the Disruptors. We are a job board that supports people from underrepresented communities getting matched with companies that they can thrive in. I'm going to send it over to my co-founder, Jasleen, so she can introduce herself.
Yeah, so I'm Jasleen. I am a career coach and I specialize in coaching women who are in male dominated spaces, especially in tech. And I'm, like Alexandria said, I'm the co founder of Disruptors. And we are welcoming Elizabeth today, who I'll let you introduce yourself, Elizabeth.
Great. Thank you, Jasleen. Hello, I'm Elizabeth Payne-Maddalena. I am a senior associate attorney here at Berenzweig Leonard, where my practice involves a lot of employment law, and we're based here in Northern Virginia, right outside of Washington, D.C.
Awesome. And so we're talking about where to get started with DEI today. And so a lot of employers get nervous around this, where they get started and they think, oh my gosh, can I ask these questions? They don't know what they don't know. Maybe they don't have an in-house HR department. And so a lot of the time where often people start is tracking diversity metrics. And so what is it that, first of all, is it legal to even ask this? And what are some other things that employers really need to know if they are going to start? Because we believe you do need to measure, you do need to track that in order to understand where you are now, what that representation looks like, where you want it to be, what some of the gaps are, what some of the barriers are. But how do you do that and make sure that you are really walking that line and understanding what's legal and what's not?
That is a great question because, and I think a lot of times this is an area where employers will maybe go online, do some quick Googling, and become very discouraged because it seems like there's a lot of information out there that can be very scary. I will start by saying this. I think when employers are thinking about putting DEI, creating DEI programs, keeping track as to DEI in their workplaces, the biggest thing to remember is these are supposed to be goals. These are not supposed to be hard targets. These are not supposed to be definitive numbers that you have to hit. That's where employers will quickly get into trouble. But when you're talking about, DEI initiatives in general, and especially in the hiring aspect, I think that is where employers should be, careful about how they are approaching things, but still think about this from a holistic approach. And what I mean by that is a lot of employers say, if we just make sure that we're hiring with DEI in mind, that solves all of our problems. And unfortunately, that's not the case. If you're hiring and only looking at hiring, but you're not looking at retention and you're not solving systemic issues that can be in place that may cause employees from different, backgrounds, from different, that fall into different, I guess you would say, DEI categories, then you are actually not solving any of the issues and probably creating more issues in the long run. So I would say the first thing is always look at this from a holistic, whole company approach.
And so where would be a good place to start? Because I would be thinking about, our main groups, like, are you BIPOC? And even in that, like, being someone who is a person of color, you get those boxes where it's like, sometimes you don't fit into a box. Sometimes it feels exclusive. From a legal standpoint, is there anything you can't ask? Because I even saw a client the other day was asking about on the job application, they were screening for whether they were the first in their family to go to pursue higher education, for example. Which I could see, to me, that was valid because I could see that they were trying to understand, really expanding their mind around diversity. But for an employee, it's nerve-wracking. And so they feel like, why are they asking me this? Are they allowed to ask me this? And so what do employers need to know about what they're allowed to ask? Like, is there anything that's off limits?
I mean, I would discourage employers from just asking straight off the bat, like, what race are you? What ethnicity are you? What is your, what is your sexual orientation? I would not ask those questions. First of all, the EEOC really does not like it when employers, especially at the hiring stage, are just asking these questions unless it is for simply keeping track internally. You should never be using this kind of information for hiring decisions or promotion decisions and employment decisions, essentially. And once you start asking those questions, especially at the hiring stage, that it can create a specter that employers don't want to create. Now, that being said, I think that the way that the employer you mentioned, Jasleen, approached this, where they asked, are you the first person in your family to go to college, is a sign to me of an employer who's thinking outside the box about how can I help bring in people from maybe different backgrounds, different life experiences, which is oftentimes helps increase and become more inclusive in the DEI spectrum without asking these prohibited questions. So I would say that is a great approach to take, where you're asking these kinds of questions that oftentimes can help you see if there's someone who may have a unique perspective that can also be helpful in their role and in their job by providing, a different kind of perspective on the work being done, or maybe has a different approach. So that is something that, I think is a great way to help identify perhaps these people from different backgrounds, more unique backgrounds, or more diverse backgrounds.
Yeah.
And I would say on that note, the other thing that I think employers should do is really take a look at your hiring processes and make sure it is not a strict, we only want people from the traditional, pathway, straight through to a, top ranked university, no gaps in employment, no community college, because we want the best of the best. First of all, the best of the best doesn't always come from those top universities. They have great candidates, not saying they don't, but where you went to school doesn't always show how, what kind of skills you have or your potential. And also just thinking about, again, there are different perspectives that can be very helpful when you bring them into your team, and thinking or asking, where on my team do we lack in different perspectives? Does everyone here come from that very traditional mindset? What are some areas where we could, for customer facing positions, or customer facing programs or products, having people coming in from different backgrounds can oftentimes help improve those products, make them more customer friendly or more approachable.
Yeah, I love that. And I think also expanding it from, because I have a background in HR, and so I'm a fan of tracking, like, at every step of the process, like, because you can often see where the diversity drops, right? And so if you've got a lot of diversity in your applications, but then the first screening, a lot of that goes away, that's important. But I think for me, what for all the employers watching is, like, really think about the candidate's experience. And so to that example that I was talking about with, are you the first in your family to pursue higher education? That might, the validity at face value is not there. And so if it's not there, you're going to have to do a good job of explaining why you're asking that question, and also being really super clear how it's being used, and that it's optional, and that you will not be penalized for not answering the question, because that's where people are like, well, I don't even want to share this because I feel like I'm gonna, they're gonna hold this against me. Like, that's a valid thing. You haven't built trust with this potential employer yet. And just in today's world where it comes to data, a lot of people are very careful, and rightfully so. I'm in Canada, so the privacy standards are a little bit more stringent here than the US, but there are still like, you know, those kind of things that you have to think about, but not just about the law, but what is the candidate experience? Because you feel like they're treating you like a number, or like you're just the token person who they're trying to get into the role.
Mhm.
That's not a good way to start off with DEI either. So it's, yes, track, but do it in a way where people understand and trust your intentions. And that's where I was getting at with even like those boxes. Sometimes like you don't need to like put people in a box necessarily. You can ask like, here are the underrepresented groups that we've got an eye on these days. And if you want, you can self-disclose and let us know if you belong to one of these groups.
Yes, and again, I think that is really important, is making sure it is very voluntary, and also making it very clear we are not using this information for making hiring determinations, and never ever using that information for hiring determinations. You are always going to select the most qualified applicant, whoever that is, but it should never be made based off of this person fits this DEI box or this box or this box. That
has unintended consequences on everyone who's applying, not just if you're an underrepresented group, but it makes it almost feel like the process isn't fair. And I think that's a common misconception we're trying to squash or disrupt, if I will, is that increasing diversity is lowering the bar on talent, right? Like that is the misconception. It's not true. It's just understanding where biases might be coming into play and screening out equally talented, if not more talented, individuals who belong to these groups.
Well, and I think that brings points to what we're going to be talking about next week is inclusive hiring practices, right? And really thinking about that from the perspective of how do we ensure that we have inclusive hiring practices from the word go? And like what we're talking about right here, really just sharing like, yeah, we're going to ask these things voluntary. Here's what we're using it for. And that transparency and that upfrontness. And people maybe have the thought of like, of course that's just assumed, or like, I don't need to say it. You always need to say it. You always need to say it, right?
And don't leave room for assumptions. There's especially when you're at that stage, because in the beginning, it's really about trust building, right? And so be transparent.
Yeah, for sure. So one of the things that we also want to talk about, right? So you have, what are you doing for tracking and like creating those initiatives and all those pieces, but there's other things that are being done at like more of a state and not so much federal level right now. Like we have anti-discrimination laws, obviously, but what do you think are some of the more interesting legal routes that states and other like even counties are maybe taking that are increasing DEI and B?
That is a great question, because we've seen one thing I always tell clients is especially when they're creating, DEI initiatives or working on creating policies and such, is every state has their own laws. That's why it's always better to have an employment attorney you can work with on these kinds of initiatives from the get-go, so they can tell you, hey, this is okay, or why don't we rephrase it in this way, or here's something that we should consider, because states are definitely, not all states, but a lot of states, including Colorado, are pushing some really great new legislation that have been enacted that helps create more equity, more diversity, or at least encourage those in the workplace. One of which being Colorado has this, and this has been something that a lot of employment lawyers across the country have paid a lot of attention to, is the salary disclosure requirements. So on any job posting being made by a Colorado employer, or which would be for a job that is open to Colorado employees remotely or physically, you must, or the employer needs to disclose what the salary range is. So minimum, maximum, and also the benefits that would be included. And this helps everyone go in who's applying knowing like, here's the range, and also helps ensure that there is more pay equity. That's why these laws are being put into place. So that way everyone knows this is the range, and that you don't have the unequal pay for equal work issue that oftentimes pops up in especially with people who identify as women. So that is one thing. Another area that is doing the same kind of pay equity advancing is the states are prohibiting employers from asking about salary history at certain stages of the hiring process. Again, meant to keep it from keep people who are being perhaps paid in a disparate way, being continue to be paid in a disparate way. Colorado also is one of the states that has passed what's called ban the box laws. Virginia also has a law like this in place. And what this is if you have, or employers are not allowed to ask about criminal convictions, except for some very specific circumstances during the hiring process. Now, this does apply to, I think, employers with 13 or more employees in Colorado. But what this does is, again, it helps people who have diverse backgrounds, who have different experiences. It helps prevent people from being shut out from jobs that they're otherwise qualified for, just on the basis that once upon a time they made a mistake. It also, as a lawyer, I will say, goes hand in hand with the idea that people can be rehabilitated in our justice system, which is supposed to be the point of the way we do things, although it doesn't always end up that way.
Yeah, I love that, because it's really looking at that equity piece of, because I mean, being in HR, that's usually the first question that's asked when you're hiring a candidate is, what are your salary expectations, or what are your, and so when I'm coaching people, I'm really trying to get them to not disclose what their pay was, not disclose what their expectations are, but really find out what is the range, what is the budget, because you don't want to just have that inequity perpetuated because you have experienced that up until this point in your life. And so how do we start breaking and disrupting, the pay transparency? And I love that more and more states are really, the law is catching up to that. So that's
I also really like it. Obviously, like, I'm biased, right? I live in Colorado. I think it's great that we have ban the box. I think it's great that we require the salary. California and New York are also doing the salary requirements now. So I think 3 major states like that are doing it. We're going to start to see a trickle effect, which I'm super, super excited about. But also talking about, if you don't live in a state in which that's true, arming yourself with the knowledge about what salary ranges are in your area or the area of the job that you're applying in for the title and the experience that you're bringing. And even if the job description doesn't say it's up for negotiation, it's always up for negotiation. So entering into that, it's enculturated as a female and other pieces, we are less likely, studies have shown, to negotiate for salary unless that's notated. There's been a bunch of studies that show if that's in the job description, women negotiate at the same rate as male identifying people do. But just know you can try and negotiate it, right? And if they do have a salary range, then the negotiation is within the salary range, or there could be other benefits. But empower yourself with the knowledge of what it is that you're asking for and being clear about that going into the negotiation.
Yeah. And so on that note, where can employers start to really understand what are the laws in their state when it comes to pay equity or anything? Like, I know I'm in Canada, and so in my province, I would go to the employment standards website of my province and make sure, because every province is different, every state is different. And so where do people start with, like, really just understanding, am I doing everything above board?
Yeah, I mean, that is a great question, as especially in today's world where, it used to be everyone went to the same office in the same place. Everyone was working in the same state, and there's you only had to really worry about your state and maybe the neighboring state's laws as an employer. And nowadays, with remote work, with our very connected society, a lot of employers have employees all across the nation or even across the world. And so I would say first is I recommend talking to an employment lawyer, even if it's just a, hey, I want to make sure we are doing what we need to do, that we're in compliance. Here are the states we have employees in or offices in, and can you just give me a quick summary of what I need to do? Having that relationship is important because it can sometimes get confusing, or you can sometimes even get state laws where one says this thing, one says this thing, and they don't line up very well. And so it's a question of then, well, how do I comply with both state laws when they don't work very well together? So I would say that's the first thing. And the other thing is if you want to get a better understanding, every state will oftentimes have a Department of Labor, Labor and Industry, or a Civil Rights Commission that you can go to and kind of get a feel for some of the general employment laws that have been put into place.
Mm-hmm.
But I would definitely recommend having an employment lawyer or having someone who is experienced in this area, who can help decipher these laws. That can be very helpful, especially in just laying the foundation, which a strong foundation is the best thing to have.
Awesome.
So I want to grow on that just a little bit, because obviously the suggestion is go get a lawyer, right? And that's great advice. But a lot of people, they get worried about it, even thinking about going to get a lawyer, and it starts to feel really stressful and oh, well, if I have to go get a lawyer, then I don't want to do it. What are 3 first steps that employers can take to start thinking about their DEI initiatives that would allow them to expand to the point where they start to feel comfortable? Okay, I should go talk to a lawyer now.
That is a great question, because I think a lot of times people do think when you get a lawyer involved, well, now you've made it a whole big thing, or lawyers just make things complicated. And so I would say, first of all, lawyers can be like doctors. You can see them when you're sick, but you can also see them to make sure that you are taking steps to be healthy and prevent getting sick. And so just because you're talking to a lawyer doesn't mean that something has gone wrong or that it is going to blow things up into something bigger. It can actually be something that is very good at helping to prevent. Now, that being said, I know that resources can be tight, and that sometimes businesses may just want to be in the beginning stages and not yet getting involved with talking to an employment lawyer about creating initiatives. And I would say that the best thing to do is to try to get a general understanding of what the state laws are, or even talking to other companies that that have done these kinds of initiatives in the same area. Again, understanding that they may not be able to give legal advice. Also, talking to people in the DEI sphere who may be able to connect you with either legal professionals or provide more insight as to some of the roadblocks that they have run into, such as both of you, could be very helpful too.
Yeah, I was just going to say that little plug for Disruptors, because that's really what we're trying to do. We're trying to connect everyone with the resources they need in a timely fashion at the phase that they're at, because it can be really overwhelming to kind of look at the system as a whole and be like, where do I even start? Because if I, the hours, we're going to really be billing it up if we're going through every single process from recruitment to onboarding to promotions with an employment lawyer, especially if you're a small business, a startup that doesn't have a lot of cash flow. And so it can be helpful to kind of reach out to your community and just understand, okay, where is the biggest risk for me? Where's the biggest opportunity? What is most aligned to my business strategy, my business goals, and really, get clear on that strategy, and then bring in the resources that you need. So I love that. And so let's switch gears. Oh, sorry. Did you have? Okay. I just wanted to switch gears here to accommodations. So for employers who have people with disabilities in their workplace, I'm really interested in this one because I recently had a client who their employer is struggling to provide the accommodations that she needs. And so what do the employers really need to know about this, about what they're allowed to ask? Because, some of these questions can get really invasive. I know here in Canada, we have specific laws and protections around people with disabilities. And so I would always advise people from an HR point of view, we just need to know what we need to know and then make the accommodations. But we don't always see that happening. And so what is your advice to employers around how to navigate accommodations?
Another really great question, because this is something that, I hear all the time. And, while I can't give legal advice on a specific situation, I think that in general, the first thing I would say to employers is there are so many ways that you can be more inclusive and welcoming to people with disabilities or people who may not qualify with as what the ADA would consider to be disabled in the employment context. But just by looking at the way that your workplace is set up, and just making sure it's a place that allows work to be done in a range of ways, and in a way so that people who may work better in one space have the ability to find that space or work within that space. Mm-hmm. Now, from the disability and ADA aspect, I would say, the first thing is every situation is going to be unique. This is a case-by-case analysis, and there is no one-size-fits-all approach to make yourself or accommodate all disabilities, because different disabilities, different positions, different people are going to require different things. Even if you're looking at, someone who is neurodivergent and requesting reasonable accommodations, just because they need this accommodation doesn't mean every other person who falls under the neurodivergent spectrum will need that or benefit from that kind of accommodation. So what I would tell, an employer is, first of all, don't play doctor. You are not a medical professional. Employers have the ability to get documentation from the treating medical provider to confirm that this diagnosis is there, and that this is the accommodation being suggested and why, essentially. But don't start playing doctor. Don't start Googling, well, what else what does this condition really entail or anything. Leave the medicine to the medical professionals. The other thing is the ADA requires the interactive process in the States here. So I tell people, be interactive, work with your employee, talk to them. If the accommodation that they're requesting is not reasonable as the ADA defines it, meaning it's something that the employer can't institute without creating an undue hardship, then work with the employee on finding a reasonable alternative. Mm-hmm. Those are things that can help create trust and help also help the employer build that relationship, shore up an existing relationship, but also it allows an employer to really engage with that employee and find a mutually agreeable solution when that's possible. The other thing I would caution employers on is never assuming someone is or is not disabled. And by that, I mean, if an employee has a disability that needs an accommodation, they will come to you. There's of course nuances to this, but in general, let them come to you and tell you that they need an accommodation, they have a disability. And one area where you see this a lot would be pregnancy. People go, oh, my employee is pregnant. They must need an accommodation because they're pregnant. No, you cannot assume that your pregnant employee now has a disability or needs these accommodations. Let them come to you and tell you what they need.
Yeah, unless there's like a safety reason. I know I used to work in oil and gas, so I worked at a refinery, and so there were places on site that you could not go if you were pregnant, just from a safety perspective. But yes, don't be the doctor, don't make assumptions. And I think from an HR point of view, what I notice is why a lot of people fail to make accommodations when they can easily do so is because they're afraid of setting a precedent. They're afraid of saying, okay, now I've allowed this employee to work remotely because of their disability, and everyone else is going to be asking for the same. And so I think that's where it's really important to be clear in your policies around, okay, what are the protected disabilities that you are recognizing? What is the process, or even not, you don't even have to get specific into what those are, but that there's a process that you're getting, whether you have in-house health department, they're going to assess what those accommodations are, and don't dig into anything else other than what the professionals are telling you what those accommodations are that need to be met. You don't need to know why. You don't need to know like the whole history, the whole medical history. And I know, like, from experience, from an HR point of view, my leaders would often get very frustrated with this because they wanted to know more, because they were afraid of making a mistake, and so my advice to those people who are afraid, I mean, they're coming from good intentions, or they're just afraid of like how that's going to impact the rest of the staff, is to really just be clear that you're making accommodations from a medical perspective. The details of it are none of anybody's business, and we're protecting the rights and the privacy of this individual, and we are an inclusive work environment, and that's it. And so this is where I really like to help people understand the difference, because it's diversity, equity, and inclusion. I don't like using the word equality at all anymore, because, and I think I mentioned this in one of our lives before, because equity is looking at the whole system, right? Because some people are going to have advantages and disadvantages in that system. Equality is when we're trying to treat everyone exactly the same. And so we're not all the same. And so you need to treat people in terms of what they need to thrive in the workplace. So it's a shift from, is this fair, to what do all the employees need in my organization to thrive? Because even when it comes to employee development, when it comes to how you're motivating people, that's going to look different for everyone anyways. So the more you get into this mindset, the more you're going to be able to unleash the potential of your workforce. So yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. And flexibility is so important. I think the last almost 3 years, it really shows why employers need to be flexible. They need to be flexible in how, not just from the perspective of the pandemic, but just in general, being flexible is better, and it helps create and foster strong relationships with your employees and equity in your workforce. And I think that, having clear policies on when is remote work allowed, or is it allowed, on how to request an accommodation under the ADA or whatever the Canadian version of that for people in Canada, that those are very important. And then following those processes, following those policies. And the other thing is, and I think you've mentioned this, Jasleen, that's very important, is protecting your employees' policies or privacy. Do not, of course, tell other colleagues if there are other employees, if they're going, well, why does so-and-so get to work from home? You do not need to say anything other than that was a decision that we have reached with them, and, we appreciate your understanding. You do not need to go telling them, well, that they have they have an accommodation for this, they have a disability. That's none of their business.
Unless the employee wants to share, because I think often the employee wants to and needs to share to be able to get that accommodation from everyone else in the team. And so, like, even this case that I'm working with now, it's like, it's not just actually the team is more inclusive than the higher up leaders, because they're more worried about the optics and like, oh, is everyone going to be asking for these accommodations now? But I think have that open conversation. And I think this really comes down to like one of the metrics we want to track in terms of your progress on DEI as an organization is psychological safety. Because if you have psychological safety in your organization, your employees are going to be okay with sharing more. They're going to be okay with you sharing more. And the more transparency and the more not just transparency in your policies, but in everything in terms of how you manage performance, the more everyone is just going to be like, oh, okay, that makes sense to me, or okay, that's what I have to do to get into that sort of to be, get that benefit as well. And then it's not seen as this like, because you want to be fostering a culture of fairness. And so it's a fine line, though. You don't if you don't have if your employee is not okay with saying, okay, this is a medical accommodation, then that's probably a sign that you have more work to do in terms of other factors when it comes to DEI.
Yeah. And I would just say it should always be the employee's choice as to what they share or don't share. I mean, and I think psychological safety, that is a great thing to bring up. I think that is why it is important to both walk the walk and talk the talk. DEI is an ongoing process. It is not a one-time thing. It is not a one-time fix. And, oftentimes I see an area where people can run into problems is when the policy says one thing, but the reality is something very different. That's not exactly what the employer is doing. That can create legal issues. That can also create just a distrust in the workplace and a lack of, employees just don't feel safe. They feel like the rug is being pulled out from under them, and why should they disclose anything that they do not need to, or share anything, or even, why stick around in a place that is playing games? So I think that is a very good point.
Absolutely. And Dr. Carrie Ann here has made a comment that psychological safety is a unicorn in the workplace for many organizations. So she will be joining us on another live, I forget, Alexandria, in December. And so maybe that's something we can talk about with her.
Yeah, for sure. And I agree with her. Unfortunately, that is a reality in a lot of organizations. And I think there's a lot of reasons for why psychological safety becomes this unicorn and mysterious thing. And to bring that into some ways that you can make that more achievable in your organization is if you prioritize human first, right? Like, I want to approach my leadership and the way we do benefits and hiring and all of these things. If you approach it from a perspective of, I'm putting the human being first, right? You are hiring human beings, not human doings. And I know that is something that is often forgot about in the tech space, but we're not computers. And so if you think about it from, oh, I'm a human, what would I need in this moment? If this was true for me, what would I need? And I think that can help people answer a lot of their own questions about how would they approach this? Why would they want to approach it this way? And then getting other perspectives like, okay, this is my opinion. What would somebody else need or want?
Yeah.
And I think the thing I encourage the most is ask your people. Don't make assumptions, just ask the question, right? If you were to have your best life working here, what would that look like? And if you don't have psychological safety, you're not going to get super great answers, but you have to show up in order to build that trust. And another caveat that I want to put in there, even if you're doing all the right things, you are creating all the psychological safety, you have humans who have been traumatized by other workplaces. They may not be ready for it. They may not trust that it's true yet. And that doesn't mean that you stop doing it.
Yeah. And I love what you're saying there about like asking people, like, what are their needs? Because in the tech industry, if we get good at this and understanding the differences in people and how their minds work and what their pain points are, like what is possible in terms of what you can do with whatever your products are, whatever your, whatever it is you're trying to create in your organization, whatever you're trying to innovate with. So I think that's where it's, again, we got to stop seeing DEI as this separate check in the box exercise. It's something that once it becomes part of who you are as a leader and part of like embedded within the processes and systems of your organization, like that's when you're going to find just solutions that you never would have got to without really tapping into the diversity.
Yes. And I would just add, because I think, Alexandria, you made this great point that there are employees who have prior workplace trauma and they are not going to be as willing to share. And so that is important for employers to remember. The fact that, as you both have said a number of times, this is not, every employee is going to respond differently. And so creating as many avenues for employees to share or give feedback is also important, because not every employee is going to want to respond to the anonymous survey or be as forthcoming on the anonymous survey, because you will always have people who in the back of their minds are saying, and sometimes rightfully so, well, how anonymous is this really? And you also there are some people who would just prefer to communicate verbally, some who prefer to communicate in a one-on-one situation. And then there are some who like the anonymous survey as a way to share, or the anonymous suggestion box as a way to share. So I think that is important too. Yes, talking to your people is key, and giving them as many avenues to share in a way that works for them and their experiences.
Absolutely. And I want to point out, Dr. Carrie Ann made another comment about you can ask the questions, but some leaders aren't ready to hear the answers. And that is 100% true, which is why we talked about you got to start with you, right? You got to start with your why and your self-awareness to get started here, because if you don't have some clarity and you don't check yourself and your own response and bias and like own ego, you're not going to be ready for that. And then you're going to create distrust and you're going to discourage people from sharing with you if your reaction to their response is negative. There's information in all of it, right? Like whether it's true or it's not true, like everything's made up, right? So what can I take from this that's beneficial? And do I want to do something about it? And taking your own agency and responsibility on yourself for how you respond as a leader, because that's where it's got to start.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit about, we've talked about, some easier ways to get started. What are some pitfalls that you really want to highlight that employers stay away from, that are really big red flags or zones that they do not want to get into when implementing diversity, equity, and inclusion?
That's a great question. And I think, the number one thing is quotas, hard targets. Say those are the quickest way to get yourself into trouble when it comes to DEI. And I know a lot of employers think, well, but how else do I, make sure I'm actually hitting these goals? Because goals are soft, and the reality is that this goes back to flexibility. You need to be flexible and understand that, this is a process, and you still want to get the best people who are qualified for the job. You want to hire the best candidates. You want to retain the best employees, but you want to make sure that you're doing it in a way that fosters DEI. And so if you're just looking at the numbers, if you're just saying, okay, I've hired from this box and this box and this box, that first of all is illegal in the U.S. Except for very rare situations. Second of all, it doesn't actually solve the problem of DEI and making sure that your workplace as a whole is fostering a diverse, equitable, and inclusive environment. Because, and I think we've mentioned this before, if you can't retain employees, there's an issue. If employee satisfaction, or if there's big pay inequities across different areas of that where the differences can be broken down by gender or race, there's a problem. Mm-hmm. So just going with, if I hit these numbers and if I hire or promote X amount of people in this group and X amount in this group, I have solved all my problems, is not the case. You have put a Band-Aid over a very deep wound, and you will soon find yourself back in the beginning of the DEI process, as well as possibly facing some issues with the EEOC, which you don't want.
So I'm curious, because actually that's news to me. I did not realize in the US setting a target. So if you say, okay, I want to recruit, so let's say it's at entry level and you're going out to universities and you're saying, okay, I want to make sure that at least 30% of the people we hire of new grads are women. That's illegal to do that?
Generally, yes, because then you are making a decision solely based on gender identity or gender identity, and that is not permitted because that would be the
Because
law.
I guess let me walk through this a bit, because I'm working in HR. We used to set targets, and so it was more to kind of like look at, okay, like how are we, because if we didn't set targets, often we wouldn't do the extra work to expand the talent pool or understand where the gaps were in our process. And so we still have that meritocracy there. We still have like that very clear, like, these are the bona fide occupational requirements. These are the skills we're looking for. These are the grades we're looking for. And so if we're still like doing it in a fair way where we're just simply saying, but we want to make sure at least 30% are women, is that in itself illegal? Or is it only if you're saying, okay, I'm just going to pick these 30% women over here and not even look at their qualifications?
So if the hiring decision in the end is hinging on, or a factor is this person, do they identify as a woman or a man or as non-binary? Then that would be illegal, because then you are making a hiring determination based on a protected class. If you are setting soft goals, where in the end you are saying, our goal is to hire this year, bring in 30% of our new hires will be people who identify as women. Then that is permissible, because that is a goal. It is not a hard target. It is not you must hit this number. And again, the thing you do not want to do is create this specter where the decision is being made based off of
Absolutely
a protected class.
Yeah. And so in those scenarios I was thinking of, it wasn't like a hard target in the sense that, okay, we didn't get what we wanted, so now let's lower the bar. That wouldn't happen. Then we would look at it and say, okay, we didn't get 30% of people who identify as, not a man. And then why is that? And what can we do next time to make sure we are hitting that goal, but not a hard target in the sense that now we are lowering the bar and saying, okay, even though you don't have this requirement, we're going to hire you.
Yes. And I think that is a great way to also incorporate and make sure that you're, again, taking the holistic approach of, well, if we didn't hit this goal, why not? And if the answer is, well, we just didn't get enough qualified applicants who identify as female, then why is that?
Mm-hmm.
Is there something in the way that your job postings are written that would make someone who identifies as female go, or as a woman, say, no, thank you? Or is there something in your initial screening process? Is it just that this is a specific field where there is not diversity, and are there opportunities for mentoring there or to help create more diversity? There's a whole, I think that is the most important question, is to always ask is why. With any DEI initiative, why are we doing this?
Mm-hmm.
Why is this an issue? Why is there this disparity? Why is it continuing? Why have we not, why are we taking this approach over this approach? Asking the why helps to make sure that your intentions are staying true, and that you are, again, solving the system as a whole and not just the little pieces.
Right. So what I'm hearing for employers watching is, like, there's a difference between goals and hard targets. Hard targets mean you're going to meet them no matter what. Goals are your aspirations in terms of that underrepresented group.
Yes.
And so the key is you have the goals for each underrepresented group, whether it's BIPOC or even Black, Indigenous, other people of color. You might have targets for each of those specific groups. for people who don't identify as men, so women or non-binary, and then LGBTQ. I don't know if that's something that's legal to track in the US. We were never tracking it from an HR perspective in Canada. Like we would handle that from a different lens, but it wasn't something. So like, I think I kind of alluded to this before. Of those groups, are there any groups where you're not allowed to set a target or a goal around?
I don't, off the top of my head, and again, not knowing all the specific
For sure. Yeah.
state laws that may have, if there's been a recent change, as I try to keep up on all of them, but sometimes they slip through. I can't think of a specific class where you would be prohibited from obtaining these internal metrics and tracking for internal use only, of course, and not for making employment decisions, just for everyone's information. There's not a specific class that I think you would be forbidden from tracking. Now, I would remind employers that, especially when it comes to, their LGBTQIA people, for example, that may be more difficult for the fact that employees may or may not be out. They may or may not be ready to come out to their employer, their workplaces. There are, that is something where oftentimes employees may not want to divulge that information and should not be put into a situation where they feel forced or cornered. So I would always remind employers to remember that you should never force an employee to disclose anything they don't want to disclose, especially anything like that. And instead, there are other ways to help make LGBTQIA employees feel more comfortable, more safe, more included in your workplaces, and foster that kind of diversity without saying or without having to say, well, are you cis, or are you trans, or are you non-binary, are you are you straight, or you identify as gay, lesbian, bisexual, pansexual. There's a number of ways you can do it without having to ask those kinds of questions and put employees in really
absolutely. And I think, and to your point, like a lot of people won't feel safe coming out, and that's their right, and that's okay. And I think it comes back to, if you're trying to track these things, being clear on what that information is how it's being stored, what it's being used for, and that it's completely optional, and how you're using it, and that sort of thing. But also for organizations where they do have people disclosing their status in terms of whether they identify as LGBTQIA+, is don't then burden them with that kind of work. Because I mean, it's different than other groups where disability sometimes can be invisible as well. But once you have disclosed, and then all of a sudden Pride Week comes around and you're being tasked with, just from an optics point of view of being like, look, we are an inclusive organization, and we're going to have you lead this sort of event or whatever. It's kind of tricky, because you want to include those voices. You don't want to host an event or do something without being informed or understanding what the real barriers are. But you also want to walk that fine line of not burdening people, especially because, and this comes up with a lot of my clients, when they're being burdened with more unpromotable work than others.
Yes.
And so, yeah. Anyways, now we're kind of going off on a tangent. I
do think that's a good thing to note is I mean, first of all, asking the people who are being impacted, who carry the burden of being someone who has the certain stigmas against them or belongs to an underrepresented community, asking them to carry the work and do that emotional labor is not fair. That is not the way to approach these. And you know, I always would tell someone, if the only time you're featuring your, for example, LGBTQIA employees is during June, there's a problem. If the only time that you're featuring them, you're talking about them as, you know, this is this employee is one of our top XYZs and our, you know, leading advocate for LGBTQIA rights in the workplace. Or I see this with people who identify as women quite a bit. They're identified as one of our top lady engineers, or this mama bear. Watch how you use your language and how you describe people. And if you're only describing them based off of them ticking a certain box like this, that's going to be a problem.
Totally. And that's going against really like fostering diversity and inclusion, because, you know, first of all, each underrepresented group is not a monolith. We've said that on here before. Now I lost my thought, but it's complicated, right? Because you want to be able to showcase this talent, but you also don't want to fall into the trap of tokenism. Because it is awful. And I think that goes to your point of the hard targets. If you are setting hard targets, that's when this, and already, even if they are goals, they're seen by other employees as hard targets. And so people who are in the dominant group often weaponize that against underrepresented groups to be like, you're only in this role because of your race, or you're only in this role because you're a woman. And that can activate imposter syndrome. And already, like, women and people of color are more likely to experience imposter syndrome regardless of their achievements. And so I think that's just another thing to be aware of, but we're kind of getting away from the legal stuff. I don't know, what other questions, because we only have 4 minutes. I know we wanted to talk a little bit about layoffs. I don't know if we have time for that.
I don't think we have time for that. So I think what will happen is hopefully Elizabeth wants to come back, and this can be a more delightful, longer conversation. But I think I really want to hone in and kind of summarize some of the pieces here, right? So overarching, if you want to put in diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging initiatives, you will want to involve a lawyer, and you will want to be very clear on what it is you're doing, why you're doing it, and then creating the how from there, and having a really clear roadmap, because that's the only way that you're actually going to accomplish these things. And a way to ensure that you're doing it legally and that it's sustainable as well is to involve a lawyer. And we'll have Elizabeth talk about her law firm here in just a second. Other pieces, if you aren't quite in that stage yet, and maybe you're even like, oh, do we have a diversity, equity, and inclusion problem? Probably, unfortunately. Like, let's start there. Like, start with the assumption that there potentially is an issue.
Or reframe as an opportunity, not a problem.
Yeah. Yes, an opportunity. But it's an opportunity to ask questions. It's an opportunity to dig in. So talking to the executive team first, like, okay, what do we need to be aware of? What are we maybe not aware of? What do our numbers that we currently have show us? What are our diversity numbers right now? What are they for entry level, junior, senior? Like, start digging into those things and asking the questions, and know your why. Why do you want to engage in this conversation, and why do you want to have initiatives in the first place? Is there anything else that you want to close with before we have Elizabeth talk about her law firm real quick?
Good.
All right, Elizabeth, how would people find you, your firm, and what states, if that matters, for what your firm represents? There we go.
Thank you, first of all, both of you, so much again for having me today. I would love to come back. This has been such a great experience. I love talking about DEI and how we as lawyers can work and help companies to create these kinds of initiatives, to put these programs into place, and to solve some of these systemic issues that, you know, unfortunately are pretty pervasive throughout the workplace. So I really appreciate it. My law firm, Berenzweig Leonard, we work with both employers and employees throughout the country. We are able to, while we're based here in Northern Virginia, we do work throughout the United States. Unfortunately, we don't have any Canadian lawyers yet, but we we do definitely are available. You can find us at berenzweiglaw.com. You can also find us on LinkedIn. We also do employment law and business law podcasts, of which I have been on a few, and which can be very helpful. And you can find those, I believe, on YouTube and Apple Podcasts and the main podcast sites for Google phones, as I don't know what those are.
Yes, we will link those. I will get those from Jenny, and we'll link those in the comments section wherever you're watching this live. Other pieces, if you are a job seeker and you are looking for a tech job, please go join us at jobdisruptors.com under the Hire Me button. If you are an employer who is taking DEI seriously and you are looking for access to a diverse community, we have one for you. Please go join us also at jobdisruptors.com under I'm Hiring. We are more than happy to support you in your movement in this space. And if you have more questions for us, we are more than happy to answer them and make connections to Elizabeth and her firm if that is something that you need as well. Jasleen, do you have any closing comments before we drop off today?
No, nothing really to add. I really look forward to continuing this conversation with Elizabeth, though, because I've learned some things today and it's got me thinking of even more questions.
Perfect. Well, thank you for joining us, Elizabeth, and everybody who is here with us. We hope you have a wonderful week. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.